Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the AFMS seminar series. Today we have the Professor Yannis Hardalupas. He will just deliver an interesting talk about the experiments in the box of the homogeneous isotropic turbulence. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are all actually ears to listen to your present.
Okay, yeah. Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to present a facility related to homogeneous isotropic turbulence, which allowed us to do different types of experiments over the years. And, sorry. Yeah, okay. So I will start by explaining why, describe the facility and demonstrate that actually you do generate homogeneous isotropic turbulence, and then try to look at two applications, which is the droplet turbulence interaction with, and eventually how this affects droplet dispersion, and also look at doing laser ignition in the same environment where you inject gaseous fuel jets, which eventually has a link with combustion. And quite often you find that what you did during your PhD does influence you eventually throughout whatever you do, because you always keep coming back to things that you found. And this is from when I did my PhD and looking at particles in a jet, which eventually are dispersing as the jet moves away from a nozzle. And what you find is that because both the particles that you inject and the air has a mean flow, and they both have initial, or the particles have initial momentum, when you try to quantify what is the consequence of the particles on turbulence, which is the bold points that you see, so the continuous line is the clean jet, no particles, and then you put the particles, and the open points are the particles which move faster than the gas flow, and then you see how the gas flow has been modified because of the has been accelerated because the particles have increased basically the through the momentum exchange, and then have increased the airflow velocity, and then you look at the turbulence, which are the points that you have here. Again, the black points are the turbulence levels of the gas flow, while the particles, which are the open points, are also have higher turbulence than the single phase flow, which is the line, which is then makes you wonder whether the velocity gradients that you generate due to the effect of the particles on the gas flow are responsible for the increase of the turbulence of the gas flow. So it is because you change effectively the velocity profile of the mean velocity profile that you have high level of turbulence, and you don't know whether that could be because you have modified the turbulence structure. So ideally, you would like to be doing an experiment where you have no mean flow, but you have turbulence, and you try then to see what happens to the flow, the particles, as you do that. And also, if we did at some point Lagrangian tracking with particles in a pipe flow, and injecting only two particles, and you see two trajectories which move over these distances of the order of 40 centimeters, so it's quite a long distance. And you see that the particles do move along fairly straight lines, And you can see even here the three-dimensional trajectories of the two particles as they are viewed from two cameras. And you see that they go along straight lines and they do change a couple of times, but this is not what maybe you would expect. If you had turbulence, you would expect maybe more noisy trajectories. So with this logic, doing an experiment where you have a homogeneous isotropic turbulence with zero mean flow, you hope that you would be able to look at particles in a smaller region in the flow because you have a mean velocity zero, and observe how the particles behave and eventually maybe understand better this interaction. And as a consequence, we decided to build this box of turbulence facility, which some other people have already done. I think Eaton in Stanford was the first to put something which I describe soon. And then there was a group in Lyon in France that actually did some improvement. So effectively, what you do is you put a cube together, and at every corner you put a loudspeaker, and all of these are aligned to look towards the center. So you can see that the frame is about 1 meter, and the logic is that you drive the loudspeakers at some frequency which is within the range of 40 to 60, and in the middle of this facility, and we could have this volume in the center, which was of the order of 40 millimeter cube or even a bit larger. We do get eventually homogeneous isotropic turbulence. So you can see here the cube in the middle, where you actually satisfy the homogeneous isotropic turbulence behavior. You can see also photographs of the 8 loudspeakers that are at the corner. And I'll explain a bit better here what each loudspeaker, how it looks like. So you see the bottom part of the loudspeaker, and on the left-hand side, you see the cover plate, which has multiple holes. So it looks like a sow head. So there are 55 holes. And as you drive basically the membrane of the loudspeaker, you just inject multiple jets, synthetic jets, through each one of these plates. And you can see a visualization of how the jets behave very close to the surface of the loudspeaker, and how eventually different amplitudes of excitation of the loudspeaker, how they modify the near field. So you expect to get, say, vortex rings on the left out of each of these jets. But eventually, as you increase the amplitude, you start getting more elongated structures. And even if you measure with PIV the flow field, you see that initially very close to the plates, you have these individual jets, but quite soon they do become, they lose their origin, and you get a flow which is more or less uniform. And effectively, because you do have this oscillation that you impose, you do have remaining velocity fluctuations. And if you now put some sitting particles inside, you see in the central region again, where you would want to take measurements to effectively characterize, first of all, the gas flow. And then we are adding droplets in order to see how they would interact with the turbulence that you generate in the background. So all you see here is some instantaneous picture from a laser sheet. So go quickly to just going through the flow to verify that we do have a homogeneous isotropic turbulence with a mean velocity 0. So this is like a big stagnation point. We look at the mean velocity in the x direction, so horizontal, and y vertical. So you see that the mean velocity that we measure is very, very low with small variability. And then the same thing applies in the other direction. Of course, we measure only two components with a laser seat, but you do see also contours in the background, and you see that really you have 0 velocity over, for sure, this square. But even outside, you do see that the contours show that the mean velocity is 0. And then we look at the RMS of the velocity fluctuations in both directions. In this particular case, we do have a certain level, which you see, and also the variability of this. So it doesn't vary a lot. So once you set your operating condition, which is the amplitude of operation from the loudspeakers, what you see is that you do have you have generated turbulence. And if we look also in the other direction, the velocity fluctuations remain very similar. And again, the contours verify the extent of this uniformity that you have in space. And in order to assess homogeneity, we take the ratio between the two directions, which should be 1. And you have some small variability allowed to 1, about 5%. And again, these contours of this show that you do have in space a similar behavior. Also, if we consider now isotropy, we see that eventually the ratio again is of the order of 1. And finally, a test which is based on a suggestion from Batchelor about what you should observe in isotropic turbulence. You do spatial correlations in 2-point correlations, either in longitudinal or lateral directions. So the horizontal axis is the distance between the 2 points. And you see how eventually these correlations behave in the 2 directions. And eventually the expression that Batchelor has, which links the lateral with the longitudinal correlation coefficients of the velocities, is the expression that you see at the bottom, which represents the open circles on the diagram, which you see that eventually is very close to the lateral measured distributions. And as a consequence, at least on the basis of this evidence, we thought that we do satisfy having homogeneous isotropic turbulence. We looked also at the 1D energy spectra, which eventually follow a -5/3. And in principle, everybody suggests that this should be happening in homogeneous isotropic turbulence. And this is something that we also observe in every direction. So effectively, for this condition that you have seen, the turbulent Reynolds number that we had was 300. And we do have also the different time scales, length scales. We know the Kolmogorov scale. And we can change this behavior by changing the excitation of the loudspeakers so that eventually we have gone up to 400 turbulent Reynolds number. So the typical, if you start now going towards the droplet-turbulent interaction, it is well recorded in literature that you do get this particle clustering. So when you put particles in a turbulent flow, you start seeing that you have higher concentration regions and also voids, while in principle you start with a uniform particle distribution. And this is just a splitter plate with a low high speed, so a shear layer. And you see how the vortices that are being generated effectively make the particles probably to centrifuge away. And this has also been observed with DNS or LES, and this is some earlier work from France. And you do see that at an instant in time, you do get this higher concentration of particles in certain regions. And the question is, why? This has consequences. So if these are evaporating droplets, then if you concentrate the droplets into a small region by increasing the concentration, you could limit the evaporation rate, because effectively within this cluster of droplets, you saturate the vapor. So eventually you cannot evaporate more, and these evaporate as groups rather than individual droplets. And an interesting thing is also that these physics are also relevant to the solar system and how eventually planets, stars are being formed due to the particles eventually being concentrated. And there are two different theories as to why this happens. One is that the centrifuging effect, so effectively you have some vertical structure which maybe centrifuges the particles out of it, and they tend then to get concentrated in a region where you do have a zero effectively velocity. And there is a different approach which uses zero acceleration points or zero velocity points to identify regions where you get these particles sticking basically, and as a consequence forming structures. What the experiment that we did is to try to understand how these droplet clusters behave while we have homogeneous isotropic turbulence and we maintain the boundary conditions the same. In order to do that, we put at the top of the box outside this 1 meter frame, we can release droplets through atomizers, different types. You can see that at the top and all the loudspeakers below. And we can generate different size distributions, which we can characterize, or we can put monoscience particles and eventually look at what happens in the box of turbulence. We use a phase Doppler anemometry to characterize the sprays that we have. We have ensured that the momentum of the sprays eventually, because we put them very far away from the region, from the box of turbulence, it is minimum, so the droplets effectively only fall due to gravity, and also the spray is wide enough to have a uniform spatial distribution of droplet concentration. So we measure with the phase Doppler, and you see multiple size distributions. You do have a problem of how to characterize, at least you do a shorter mean diameter and you see that we keep increasing it by changing the operating conditions, but also we can use different mean diameters, so the arithmetic mean or a number based 60% or 5% by volume, We have also the spread of the size distributions, which you see the definitions here. So there are many ways that you can characterize effectively all these size distributions. And but still, we need to somehow use some scaling parameters. So the Stokes numbers do have a time scale for the response of the particles. And eventually, we want to have some representative diameter in the spray in order to evaluate the Stokes numbers. Also, the settling parameter, so the gravitational effect, you do have a parameter which tells you how significant it could be. And you can see what the value is. So obviously, when the droplets become very large, then this becomes more significant, but generally it is low. And the Stokes numbers over different sizes, they vary from something which is close to eventually following the flow perfectly at 1 micron. And then at some point you go through a Stokes number of around 1, which is suppose the region, the condition, as the literature suggests, where you do get maximum preferential concentration. And if you look at instantaneous distribution, we use a scattered light, and you see basically the white dots. We subtract the mean intensity, averaged over many images, from the instantaneous. In principle, if the particle distribution is uniform in space, which you see here that it is a part of the Gaussian distribution of the laser light, which gives variation in the intensity, you would expect after you subtract the mean intensity, the distribution that you have, the instantaneous distribution, would be very similar to what you saw at the beginning, which is what you see. And then we can set a threshold to identify where the particles are. And by doing that, you start seeing now black dots, which are the particles, or at a higher concentration, you see again more clearly the clusters that are formed and the regions where you have voids. While you started with a distribution which was uniform in space. And to verify that actually when you have very small particles, you do have a random distribution in space. This is the image that you get for very small seeding particles. And when you have larger droplets, you do see eventually clusters being formed, which eventually are distinctly concentrated in certain regions and have voids in others. A method that has been used is to quantify this redistribution in space, which we haven't used, is to put a uniformly distributed grid of shells on the images and then measure the number of particles that you have in each shell to quantify effectively what is the distribution. A problem that this has is that as you change the size of the cells, you change the concentration of the particles that you have. And as a consequence, you don't know really what should be the right size of the cell to do that. So there was this group in France that suggested of using the Voronoi analysis, which, and I will demonstrate what it does. So you have this image of particles, and you apply Voronoi analysis, which effectively puts a convex polygon around each particle, and all the points inside this polygon are closer to the single particle that is surrounded than any other particle that you have on your image. So what eventually the Voronoi analysis does, it generates all these areas around each individual particle, and by doing so, and this is, you see that the dimensions of its shell change, its particle then can be characterized as a local concentration, because you have one particle over an area, which if it is large, the concentration is low, while in these regions here that you have clusters, the areas are all very small. So for each individual particle, locally you calculate a very high concentration. So this is ideal, because eventually it doesn't matter how many particles you have. By using this method, you can quantify the particle concentration based on a single particle. And eventually the Voronoi analysis has, if you do the statistics, eventually there is, if you have a random distribution, you get a function, which is what you see with the areas that you see. It's a normalized areas, Voronoi areas. And the line that you see here is the probability density function of the Voronoi areas when you have a random distribution, while the red line is when you don't have a random distribution and you form clusters and voids. And the standard deviation of the areas when you have a random distribution is 0.53, which is important, while if your standard deviation of the, say, the red distribution, if it is lower than 0.53 or higher than 0.53, you have some organized arrangement and you have clusters and voids depending eventually of how this distribution is. And you should have both, because if you concentrate the particles at one region, then another would have no particles at all. So when you apply that with the polydispersed droplets, you do see that you do have effectively a non-random distribution, as expected, since we have seen the images that we see. And then we need eventually to define what the Stokes number is, which is relevant in order to scale properly the size distributions. So we play with many different mean diameters, and we try to see which one would give you a Stokes number of the order of 1 when you do have maximum preferential concentration. And the values that eventually seems to be working better is an arithmetic mean diameter, or a 60% number based mean diameter, or a 5% volume mean diameter. And what you see here is the standard deviation of the Voronoi areas on the vertical axis as a function of the droplet Stokes number. And you see that close to 1, you do get the very much larger deviation from 0.53. So 0.53 is outside the scale of the axis. So you do have effectively very strong redistribution and formation of clusters. And you see how things are changing also with the Stokes number. These variations then are reduced. And yeah, typical, the size distribution, when you calculate these mean diameters, they do represent different parts of the distribution accordingly. And if we change the level of turbulence, so going from black to green, red, and yellow, you see again the standard deviation of the Voronoi areas, which keep increasing as you increase the level of turbulence. So you see those at the top, the values are bigger, which indicate that actually you do have some stronger redistribution of the particles at high levels of turbulence. So effectively, the Stokes number scaling, it doesn't seem to be able to capture well the behavior at higher levels of turbulence. And this also shows what happens as a function of the turbulence Stokes number. So this is putting now all the points, and you may argue that there is some kind of correlation of the fluctuations of the Voronoi areas, which is a magnitude of the clustering that you get as a function of the Stokes number, and you see that you get a maximum at around 1, and there is some variation around as you change the turbulent Reynolds number. So effectively, we have demonstrated that there is clustering, there is some dependence with a turbulent Reynolds number, and then we wanted to see what happens in the time domain. So you see now high-speed observations of the Voronoi areas, which are superimposed on the images of particles. You may start identifying a cluster and seeing how this evolves sequentially in time. And you may see here, for example, that two clusters have merged and became a bigger one. And the question is, okay, how we could use again the Voronoi area now on an instantaneous basis. And you see now PDFs of Voronoi areas, which are all superimposed, the black points, which have some variability because they are instantaneous from different instances in time. Still, you do see that they deviate from the dashed red line, which shows the what a random distribution should be. And if you average these instantaneous distributions, you see now that the noise has gone and you do clearly have clustering. So we look at the time-dependent standard deviation of the Voronoi areas as a function of time normalized with the Kolmogorov scale. And you do see eventually that we have a long record, so we can actually calculate the power spectrum of the fluctuations of the Voronoi areas, which is what you see here. And this actually seems to have a similar behavior as some of the characteristics of the turbulent flow. Yeah, I'll skip this. A second aspect that we'd like to have is the length scale of the clusters. So we can calculate in space on the basis of the instantaneous images, time-dependent, the radial distribution function, which is a correlation of the concentration in space. So you see eventually how the radial distribution function changes, and this is now in space. So this is normalized with the Kolmogorov length scale. And you see that eventually when the radial distribution function crosses the value of 1, which represents the uniform distribution, that gives you a dimension of the clusters, which in this case is of the order of 30 length scales of the Kolmogorov. So, and this is quite similar for many science distributions. So these are values for many different science distributions. So we can also look at since we have time-dependent also radial distribution functions, we can plot also the length scale variations in time. And you see that again, there is a variation in the length scales of the clusters, which is of the order of 10 to 30 Kolmogorov scales. And definitely all the clusters are much bigger than the Kolmogorov scale. We can get also the distributions, so of how the Voronoi areas behave, and these are average of many frames for many different distributions. And we find that by changing the distributions, for example, you see the green line here, or the black line, which represents different atomizers, different distributions, that you have a quite large variability of the distribution of the Voronoi areas, which shows a significant change of the clustering that you have in time. And again, although the subdomain diameter of both distributions are the same, you do find that eventually the shape of the distribution of the Voronoi areas is different for different Stokes numbers, which shows that actually the SOTA mean diameter is not a good mean diameter to use in order to understand this, because the distributions that we're using here are actually the same SOTA mean diameter but completely different shapes, and this is reflected of how the clustering behaves. And you can see also the spectra of these variations that we have from the Voronoi analysis. And we do find that you have a -2 slope, which eventually deviates from the -5/3. And on the basis of that, we can look at the mechanisms. So we can calculate from the turbulent characteristics the topological structures and identify the location of the mean velocity, the zero velocity points. And eventually, because we have time-dependent airflow characteristics of the mean velocity points, we can calculate the spectra of the mean velocity points, which is the red line that you see. The green line is the polydispersed droplets for a particular Stokes number of the order of 1, that you have quite a strong preferential concentration. And the black line is what the random distribution of the Voronoi areas should look like. And you see that actually the distribution of the zero velocity points coincide fairly well with the distribution of the Voronoi areas of the droplets, which is at least an indication, it cannot be verification, that the sweep and stick mechanism, which is associated with the zero velocity points in the turbulence, where effectively the particles stick to form clusters, appears to be a better way to explain why the turbulence generates clusters. It is hard for experiments to give you eventually all the answers. So more recently, we have gone to do computations or DNS. It is not easy to do many particles. Lagrangian has a very large demand for to track many particles. So it is slow and difficult to put many particles in. But these are computations of homogeneous isotropic turbulence. And you see clusters for specific Stokes number. And we had to develop a new method, an Eulerian approach, which can capture eventually clusters. The fact that you use effectively the particles are a continuum, and you solve the particles in an Eulerian space. This is the method in the middle that we developed, where effectively we introduced an additional equation, energy equation, which allows the particles to cross trajectories. So effectively, we have negative and positive kinetic energy. So particles that cross going left and right can be distinguished because otherwise the kinetic energy does not allow you to have sign. And as a consequence, we can use the Eulerian space to get more accurate distributions of clusters, which in principle agree well with what you get from a Lagrangian calculation. And this is what happens when you change the Stokes number and you start getting more diffused clusters, but still you can see that you do have very strong voids and formation of clusters. And we do still analyze, and actually we have at this moment a paper that we have submitted in JFM, which tries to, having done the analysis of those, to demonstrate eventually where the clusters are formed. A very interesting feature is that you see that the clusters, although they have a thickness of a Kolmogorov scale, they are very long in the other direction, which in some cases they cover a very large part of the volume that you observe here, which makes you wonder why, when you look at things that are happening at the Kolmogorov scale, in some other direction you get length scales which are very strongly anisotropic. So you have these, say, tubes which are bent and continuous for a very long distance in space, which typically you wouldn't expect to have at the Kolmogorov scale. So I will not say anything more on that. I will very quickly, so because I appreciate that I am a bit late, I will not go into the details, but I just want to demonstrate to you how you can use the Kolmogorov, the homogeneous isotropic turbulence box to study ignition in a highly turbulent environment without mean flow. And effectively, we wanted to see how much energy you need to put in order to do laser ignition of methane jets, but having all around these jets very high turbulent environment, which is not typically what you see with experiments with jets, say, are typically done in a quiescent environment. But if I inject in a highly turbulent environment, I modify the entrainment rate due to the surrounding turbulence. And then if we want to ignite fuel, how easy or difficult it is, or how much energy you need to put in the laser to have ignition. So we set up now a pulse jet in the middle of the box of turbulence to do pulsed injection. And I want to show what actually happens. So, and this is a video. So you have a turbulent Reynolds number of 0. So basically the box of turbulence does not, the loudspeakers do not operate. And eventually you do inject, and you will see in a moment the flame that is formed. But this is without any, in a quiescent environment. And then on the right, you do have turbulence number of the order of 200 with the box of turbulence operating. You will hear the sound as well. And you will see how the flame actually, which is ignited by a laser, a pulsed laser. So it is multiple times that you keep igniting the jets. And here you will see that you have a fairly stable flame on the left, while on the other side, due to the turbulence, you have failures. Sometimes there is no flame. Sometimes it does exist, but it extinguishes. So I'll play the videos. So this is like a lighter, but the lighter is a laser pulse. And you see that you keep igniting it repeatedly as a lighter will do, and there is no turbulence. But if I do, and you see how noisy the jet, the box is, so the amplitude of the loudspeaker is quite high. And you can see that sometimes there is no flame formed. Sometimes you have a very strong emitted light, and sometimes the flame starts and then extinguishes. And you have a very high variability, and this is because of the levels of turbulence that you generate. you can vary it because of the loudspeaker amplitude, and you can vary the amplitude while you maintain also the eventually a mean flow zero. So you don't have any mean flow effects, which could affect your turbulence. And yeah, you can see actually here a sequence in time where you put the laser in. So the plasma is the pulse for the laser. You see when the flame occurred, and there are here other plasmas which eventually happen somewhere in between, and you never manage to get a flame. Also, you can see that the flame here was more bright, you have more light. Here the flame was weak, and you see that actually you get very large variability. And I will not expand on that so that I can finish, but we have measured basically with laser diagnostics what is the local equivalence ratio at the locations that you do have the laser ignition. So we know the air to fuel ratio locally at the location of the spark, and you see at different points within the jet that the equivalence ratio is reduced as you increase the level of turbulence, and eventually this is conditional on having ignition, successful ignition. Of course, there are failures, and you see that as you change the points where you place your igniter, you do get a different chance to ignite depending on the equivalence ratio, while at other points you do have a different behavior, and eventually we have expanded this analysis, but I don't really have enough time to do, but I wanted just to give you an indication of how the box of turbulence can be used for many different applications. We have looked also on collisions of droplets or interaction of a solid particle with droplets hitting on the particle and maybe coating it. So it is a facility that in principle can be used to analyze in a more stationary manner, because you have a mean velocity which is zero, phenomena that become quite difficult to track if you have mean flows, because everything moves with the flow. And when you do experiments, you have a stationary operating measuring system, which mainly you have to make it to move with the flow, which is quite hard. And as a consequence, you have only very limited time to study the phenomena that are involved. So I will stop here, and yeah, I would just acknowledge the people who have worked on this over the several years to look at different aspects, and we are still using the facility to study even more. And I'll stop here, and thank you.
Thank you so much, actually, to give this great presentation. It was very informative. If we have any question from the audience, please skip up, or maybe you can type in the chat box. Any question from the audience?
Hi, Yannis. Great presentation. Thank you. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. It's a problem that comes up for us with bubbles in water, but I was curious to hear for you guys if you ever have anything where the density of the particles is changing in your work. I imagine with hydrocarbons and those kinds of things, while the diameters have a spectrum, there might also be density differences that then change your Stokes number.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, Um, yeah, with particles in air, your density is always very high relative to the air. So you are always in a regime that you don't have when you have bubbles in water. And then, yes, additional contributions come, or forces appear, which you don't have when you look at droplets or particles. So, yeah, there is a difference. For sure, this where the bubbles will concentrate due to turbulence through clustering will be different as a consequence of the forces that you do have. There are boxes of turbulence in liquid flows that have been done in experiments in the literature do exist. And I think also looking at bubbles as well as particles in water, which is also quite interesting to do, again, with the logic of having a zero mean flow, so a very large stagnation point, and seeing eventually how the fluctuations of the flow even could break up the bubbles, for example, as you steer them. We have looked at, in the box of turbulence, for example, how a continuous liquid jet, which is exposed to turbulence, could break as a consequence of turbulence. So, yeah, it is definitely different if you have bubbles in water, and it is also very interesting to look at it in a box of turbulence.
Because that leads into my next question in terms of, did you notice many coalescences between the droplets after clustering, affecting your bubble size distribution with time, or droplet size distribution in your case?
Actually, yeah, I didn't present. I mean, we did put a lot of effort to try to measure collisions of droplets. Okay, and of course that could lead to coalescence. And you set up, your high-speed system to very highly magnified in order to manage eventually within the box of turbulence to see collisions between droplets. And you run always out of time. We couldn't actually capture, I mean, it becomes impossible to actually perform the experiment because at the end, the probability of collision, it is low. Of course, this depends on the concentration of the droplets that you put in. But again, in the computations, you can put an infinite number of droplets, but in the experiment, you cannot do the same.
Yeah.
And, you find even computations that if I put a actual volume around the point particles that are used to represent the actual size that they have been simulating, you may have such a high concentration where the particles will overlap, which physically it is impossible to happen. So in the experiment, it is not easy to have these very, very high concentrations. And even if you have very, very high concentrations, then it becomes very hard to actually see what is going on because you have effectively such a dense cloud. So based on what we could put in, the concentration to be reasonable, to be able to observe effectively what is going on, we couldn't capture. And then we changed the experiment and we put a solid particle in the middle of the box of turbulence. And we allowed now all the droplets in the spray to collide with something now which is stationary. So at least if by putting a stationary object, we increase the probability. And then you start seeing collisions and how liquid gets deposited. And what we measured is the liquid which is collected on the solid target. But again, the number of images that you can capture where you do have collisions is very low. And if you look at the collision probabilities that are used in computations, you find that the probability that they calculate is too high relative to what we see in the experiments, which makes the experiment difficult to happen. So, and if you increase the turbulence, it becomes even harder to see collisions. So
It's a tricky problem.
Yeah. I mean, you couldn't really generate enough statistics to analyze because you have effectively to be looking at with high magnification at a small area to observe the collisions, which immediately you limit your probability because you lose whatever happens in space. And waiting there for a very long time with a high-speed imaging system, which eventually every second you have to stop to empty the memory.
I know your pain well. I know your pain well.
Impossible to keep persuading a student that it's a good idea to keep
as an
doing
experimentalist, I know your pain well, and that's why I've been so excited to see your work that's been combining the computation with the experimental facility. No, it's
that's
been fantastic.
why we did also the computational study, because eventually you start trying to bring some information in to help you also with the experiment.
Fantastic work. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for accepting our invitation, and actually hope you have a lovely day ahead. Yep. Thank you.
The sun is out in London, so yes, it is.
Yeah. Hope to see you in Australia.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you come. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.